Hi there, welcome to Fantasy Hub. I'm Mia, your storyteller. Today's story is filled with heartache, discovery, and a twist you won't see coming. So let's begin.
You want to know how I fell in love with a woman who could read minds? Well, not literally, though. Sometimes I wondered. It started in a bookstore called Whispering Pages, tucked between a vintage clothing shop and a cafe that served overpriced lattes to undergrad students. I was there hunting for research material, something obscure about cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, when I heard this voice behind me, looking for Jung or Freud. Because, honey, you're in the wrong section. Entirely. I turned around, ready to deliver my usual polite but dismissive response to unsolicited advice, and found myself staring at the most striking woman I'd ever seen. She had this wild, curly auburn hair that seemed to have its own gravitational field, and these piercing green eyes that made me feel like she was reading my thoughts. Which, as I later discovered, she basically was. "I'm actually looking for something on CBT applications," I said, trying to sound professional and failing miserably. She tilted her head, studying me with an intensity that made my stomach flip. "Dr. Emma Chun, right? I saw your lecture series online. Fascinating work on anxiety disorders." Then she smiled, and I swear the temperature in the bookstore rose 10 degrees. "I'm Georgia Blackwood. I do consulting work." "What kind of consulting?" I asked, though part of me was more interested in the way she moved, like she was performing an invisible dance. "I read people," she said simply. "Their tells, their desires, what they're not saying. Some call it cold reading, others call it mentalism. I call it Tuesday." I should have walked away. I had a reputation to maintain, after all. Dr. Emma Chun, the serious academic, the woman who'd built her career on evidence-based practice and peer-reviewed research. But something about Georgia pulled me in like gravity. "Prove it," I heard myself saying. Her smile turned predatory. "You're here because you're procrastinating on a book chapter that's due next week. Something about therapeutic resistance. You've been avoiding it because you're a perfectionist who's terrified of criticism, and you'd rather research for 6 hours than write one imperfect paragraph." My mouth fell open. She'd nailed it completely. "Lucky guess," I managed. "Your coffee cup," she said, nodding toward the travel mug in my hand. "Still full, but you've been carrying it for at least an hour. The condensation pattern gives it away. You're not here for caffeine. You're here to procrastinate. Your bag is packed with 3 different notebooks because you can't decide which organizational system will make your thoughts good enough, and that slight tension in your shoulders. Classic perfectionist posture." I stared at her somewhere between impressed and terrified. "Are you some kind of detective?" "Better," she said. "I'm a mentalist. And you, Dr. Chun, are fascinating." She leaned closer, and I caught a whiff of her perfume, something dark and complex that made my head spin. "Want to grab coffee and let me tell you more about what I see?" The first session, what was supposed to be a quick coffee to discuss cognitive behavioral techniques, turned into 3 hours of Georgia reading me like a first edition paperback. We found a corner table at the cafe next door, and she proceeded to unravel 34 years of carefully constructed psychological defenses with the casual precision of someone untying shoelaces. "You're afraid of being predictable, Georgia?" murmured, tracing the rim of her cup with one finger. I found myself watching that finger with an intensity that was definitely not professional. "That's why you over-prepare. Control is your safety net." My pulse spiked. No one had ever dismantled me so fast, so completely. It was like she had a map to all my secret territories. Your presentation style," she interrupted gently. "I watched your lectures online, remember? You have 3 backup points for every main argument, and you check your notes even when you clearly know the material by heart. Classic overcompensation for fear of being caught unprepared." I took a shaky sip of my latte, trying to regain some equilibrium. So what else do you see? Loneliness, she said without missing a beat. Despite being surrounded by colleagues and students all day, you eat lunch alone in your office, don't you? Probably while grading papers or answering emails because stopping to just eat feels too vulnerable. The accuracy was devastating. I felt exposed, like she'd stripped away all my professional armor and left me sitting there in my underwear. And Georgia continued, leaning forward with that same intense focus. You're attracted to me. Your pupils have been dilated for the past hour. You keep mirroring my posture, and you've touched your hair 17 times since we sat down. Classic signs of romantic interest. Heat flooded my cheeks. And it's okay, she said softly. The feeling is mutual. By the second latte, I was spilling more than sugared childhood anxieties about never being smart enough. My imposter syndrome despite years of academic success. My fear of the upcoming TV appearance where I'd be debating Dr. Richard Langley, a notorious traditionalist who'd been making headlines with his anti-progressive stance on mental health treatment. Georgia just listened, occasionally asking questions that cut straight to the heart of whatever I was trying to articulate. It was like she had a PhD in Emma Chun studies. Tell me about this TV debate, she said when I mentioned it for the third time. It's next week. Some morning show wants to do a segment on modern psychology, help or harm. They've got me representing the progressive side and Langley representing, well, basically everything I stand against. He thinks modern therapy coddles people, that we should all just toughen up and get over our problems. And you're nervous because I laughed, but it came out shaky. Because he's going to tear me apart on live television. He's been doing this for decades, and I'm just me. Georgia leaned in then, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in her. Green eyes. Let me help you. Mentalism isn't just tricks. It's about knowing what people want before they do. I can teach you to read him, to anticipate his moves. You do that? Emma, she said, and the way she said my name made something flutter in my chest. What I want is to see you demolish that pompous ass on national television. And what I wanted? That was becoming dangerously clear. We spent the next week meeting every evening, ostensibly to prepare for the debate. Georgia taught me to watch for micro-expressions, to notice the subtle ways people telegraph their intentions before they're even consciously aware of them. Langley will lean back when he thinks he's made a winning point, she explained, demonstrating with exaggerated body language that made me laugh despite my nerves. He'll also touch his tie. It's a self-soothing gesture when he's actually uncertain about something. We practiced in my apartment, Georgia playing Langley while I tried to apply her techniques. She was a disturbingly good actor, adopting his pompous tone and condescending mannerisms with uncomfortable accuracy. Dr. Chan, she said in his voice, surely you don't believe that coddling people with safe spaces and trigger warnings actually helps them cope with real-world challenges? I believe, I replied, watching her face for the tells she'd taught me to spot, that creating environments where people feel safe to explore difficult emotions is the foundation of actual healing, not coddling. Good, Georgia said, dropping the character, but watch my eyes when you answer. See how they narrow slightly? That means I'm preparing a counterattack. Be ready for it. These practice sessions had an unexpected side effect. The more time we spent together, the more aware I became of the electric tension between us. Georgia had a way of standing just a little too close, of letting her hand linger when she adjusted my posture or pointed out something on my notes. And I found myself hoping these moments would last longer than they did. You're getting distracted, she said during one particularly intense practice session. We'd been going for 2 hours, and I was having trouble concentrating because she'd taken off her blazer and rolled up her sleeves, revealing elegant forearms that I kept finding myself staring at. Sorry, Emma. She stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. What are you thinking about? The honest answer would have been, how much I want to kiss you right now. But instead I said, I'm worried I'm going to freeze up tomorrow. What if I forget everything you taught me? You won't, she said with absolute certainty. You know, why? Because you're brilliant and you're passionate about what you do, and when push comes to shove, that matters more than any technique I could teach you. She reached up and brushed a strand of hair away from my face, her fingertips, praising my cheek. Trust yourself, Emma, I do. The air between us crackled with possibility. For a moment, I thought she might kiss me. For a moment, I thought I might let her. But then my phone buzzed with a reminder about the early call time for the show, and the spell broke. I should get some sleep, I said reluctantly. Good idea. But Georgia didn't move away immediately. She stayed close, studying my face with that intense focus I was becoming addicted to. Emma? Yeah? Tomorrow, when you're up there, remember that you have something he doesn't. What's that? You actually care about helping people. That's not a weakness, it's your superpower. The studio was smaller than I'd expected, all harsh lights and cameras that looked like mechanical spiders. I sat in the green room, reviewing my notes for the 100th time, when Georgia appeared in the doorway. What are you doing here? I asked, surprised. Moral support, she said, settling into the chair next to me. Plus, I wanted to see you destroy Langley in person. Unterrified, I admitted. Good, use it. She reached over and took my hand, her thumb tracing circles. On my palm. Remember what we practiced. Watch his tells. Trust your instincts. They called us to set a few minutes later. The stage was arranged like a living room, with 2 armchairs facing each other and the host's chair positioned between us. Dr. Langley was already there, looking exactly like I'd expected, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Dr. Chun, he said as I approached, offering a handshake that lasted just long enough to be uncomfortable. I've read some of your work, interesting theories. The way he said interesting made it clear he meant the opposite. The debate started. Cordially enough, the host asked softball questions about our backgrounds and philosophies, but I could see Langley preparing his attack, just like Georgia had predicted. The subtle shift in his posture, the way his fingers drummed against his. Chair arm, Dr. Chun, he said when the topic turned to modern therapeutic approaches. Don't you think this current trend of treating everyone like they're fragile is doing more harm than good? When I was starting out, we taught people resilience, not helplessness. I felt my prepared response stick in my throat. This was at the moment I'd been dreading. But then I caught Georgia's gaze in the front row, that smirk, that challenge, the absolute confidence in her eyes. And then I snapped. Psychology evolves, doctor, unlike your bedside manner. The audience gasped, then burst into applause. Langley's face went red, and I saw him touch his tie, exactly what Georgia had predicted. Excuse me, he sputtered. You heard me, I continued, feeling emboldened by the audience's reaction. You're talking about resilience, but what you're really advocating for is the same outdated approach that told people to walk it off when they were struggling with serious mental health issues. That's not resilience, that's negligence. The debate became a bloodbath after that, but not in the way I'd expected. Instead of Langley tearing me apart, I found myself systematically dismantling his arguments while he grew more and more flustered. Every tool Georgia had taught me to watch for was there. The defensive posture, the micro-expressions of uncertainty, the way he kept checking his notes when he was losing ground. But the real earthquake came during the cue in a portion. A viewer called in asking about LGBTQ plus mental health, specifically whether conversion therapy could be considered a legitimate treatment option. Langley's response was predictably horrible. Well, I think we need to be careful about affirming what might simply be a phase or confusion, especially in young people. I felt something ignite in my chest, a fury so pure and bright it scared me. I thought about all the students I'd counseled over the years, the ones who'd been rejected by their families, who'd attempted suicide because people like Langley had, made them believe there was something fundamentally wrong with them. As a lesbian, I heard myself saying, the words tumbling out before I could stop them, I can confirm that your ignorance is more harmful than any diagnosis you could give. The studio went dead silent. I'd just come out on live television, something I'd never planned to do, certainly not in this context. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure the microphone would pick it up. But then the audience erupted in cheers. And I saw Georgia in the front row with tears streaming down her face and the proudest smile I'd ever seen. The rest of the show passed in a blur. Langley looked like he'd swallowed his tongue. The host seemed thrilled by the unexpected drama, and I felt like I was floating somewhere outside my body, watching this braver version of myself say things I'd only dreamed of saying. When it was over, I practically ran to the green room, my hands shaking with adrenaline. Georgia was there waiting for me, and the moment I walked through the door, she pushed me against it, her lips crashing into mine with a desperation that matched my own. That, she breathed against my mouth, her hands mapping my waist like she was memorizing me for a performance, was the sexiest thing I've ever seen. I moaned into her kiss, my hands tingling in her wild hair. All the tension from the past week, all the carefully maintained professional distance, all the stolen glances and almost moments came rushing to the surface. Georgia, I gasped as she moved her attention to my neck, her teeth grazing the sensitive skin there. You were magnificent, she murmured, her voice rough with want. Absolutely magnificent. My blazer hit the floor somewhere between her second kiss and the moment she lifted me onto the makeup counter. We were in a television studio, for God's sake, but I couldn't bring myself to care. Not when she was looking at me like I just conquered the world, not when her hands were doing things that made my entire nervous system light up like a Christmas tree. I started to say, but she silenced me with another kiss, this one softer but no less intense. We should celebrate, she finished for me, your place or mine. That night changed everything. We didn't make it to either of our apartments. We ended up at Georgia's place, a converted loft above an art gallery that was exactly as eclectic and fascinating as she was. Books on psychology sat next to tomes on magic and mentalism. Crystals shared shelf space with academic journals, and the whole place smelled like sandalwood and possibility. Drink? She asked, but I was already crossing the room toward her. Later, I said, surprising myself with my boldness. What followed was the kind of night that romance novels are written about. Georgia was as skilled at reading my body as she. Was it reading my mind, seeming to know exactly where to touch, how much pressure to apply, when to be gentle and when to be demanding? Tell me what you want, she whispered against my ear as we tumbled onto her bed. I started, then stopped, suddenly shy despite everything that had already happened between us. Don't think, she said, her fingers tracing patterns on my skin that made me arch toward her. Just feel. What do you feel? Your hands, I managed. Wrong. Her teeth grazed my collarbone. You feel want. Say it. I want you, I breathed, and saying it out loud made something inside me break open. Better, she said, and then proceeded to demonstrate just how well she could read every signal my body was sending. We developed a routine after that. During the day, we We worked on our shared practice, a revolutionary approach that combined traditional therapy with Georgia's unique insights into human behavior. She had an uncanny ability to spot the things patients weren't saying, the emotions they were trying to hide even from themselves. Mrs. Patterson, she said to one of my longtime clients during a joint session, "You keep talking about your husband's drinking, but you haven't mentioned how angry you are about it. Why?" Mrs. Patterson blinked in surprise. I'm worried, not angry. Your jaw tenses every time you say his name, Georgia observed gently. Your hands clench. Anger is just worry with teeth, and yours are showing. It was like watching a master class in human psychology, but from an angle I'd never considered. Georgia didn't have my academic training, but she had something equally valuable, an intuitive understanding of people that complemented my clinical knowledge perfectly. Our private sessions, however, were something else entirely. "Close your eyes," Georgia would whisper in the dark of her bedroom, rain tapping against the windows while candles flickered around us. "Tell me what you feel." And I would try to put words to the sensations she was creating with her touch, the way she seemed to know my body better than I knew it myself. "Your hands," I would gasp, arching toward her. "Wrong," she would say, her voice a low purr. "You feel surrender." She was right, of course. With Georgia, I learned to let go of the control that had defined my entire adult life. She taught me that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was admit you didn't have all the answers. The night we broke her bed frame was particularly memorable. Shattering the furniture was not part of the therapy plan, I panted afterward, surveying the damage to her antique four-poster bed. Georgia just laughed against my bare shoulder, her fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. "Darling, you literally wrote the book on repressed desires. Blame yourself." "I did not write a book about chapter 7 of your first publication," she interrupted with a grin. "The psychological impact of emotional suppression. Ring any bells?" I groaned and buried my face in her neck. "You're never going to let me live that down, are you?" "Never," she confirmed, pressing a kiss to my temple. "Besides, I kind of like having evidence of our ... Enthusiasm. Going public with our relationship, both personally and professionally, came with consequences I hadn't fully anticipated. The university where I taught wasn't officially homophobic, but they weren't exactly thrilled about my television appearance either. The dean called me into his office the Monday after the show aired. "Dr. Chun," he said, not quite meeting my eyes, "I wanted to discuss your recent media appearance." "What about it?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I knew where this was going. "Well, it's come to our attention that some of our donors were concerned about the direction of your commentary, and there are questions about your new practice partner and whether her methods align with our academic standards." The subtext was clear: tone it down or face the consequences. I walked out of that meeting feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. Georgia found me in my office an hour later, slumped over my desk with my head in my hands. "Bad meeting?" she asked, settling into the chair across from me. "They're pulling my guest lecture series," I said without looking up. "Apparently, my personal choices reflect poorly on the department's reputation." Georgia was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "This is my fault. If I hadn't encouraged you to be so bold on that show, don't..." I looked up at her, seeing the guilt written across her face. "Don't you dare apologize for helping me find my voice." What I said needed to be said, and I'm not sorry I said it, even if it cost you your career. "My career was built on helping people," I said, the clarity of it surprising me. "If I can't do that authentically, then what's the point?" We started working on our own practice full-time after that. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, leaving behind the security of academic tenure to build something new with a woman I'd known for less than 6 months. But it worked. Our combined approach, my clinical training and Georgia's intuitive insights, attracted clients who'd been failed by traditional therapy. We helped people who'd been told they were too complicated, too resistant, too broken to heal. You two make a good team, said Marcus, one of our first clients, during a session about 3 months after we'd opened our practice. He was a veteran dealing with PTSD who'd cycled through half a dozen therapists before finding us. How so? I asked. She sees what I'm not saying, he said, nodding toward Georgia, and you help me figure out what to do about it. It's like having a translator and a GPS at the same time. Georgia squeezed my hand under the table, and I felt that familiar flutter of pride and affection our methods drew criticism from some quarters. Traditional therapists called our approach unscientific. Academic journals refused to publish our case studies. Dr. Langley, still smarting from our television encounter, went on a minor media tour claiming that we were charlatans preying on vulnerable people. But we also had defenders, former clients, spoke out about their experiences. Other therapists, quietly at first, began reaching out to learn about our techniques. A small but growing community of mental health professionals started, incorporating elements of our approach into their own practices. The best minds are the ones that stay open, Georgia said one evening as we reviewed yet another scathing critique of our work in a professional journal. Is that your professional opinion, Dr. Blackwood? I teased. She'd been working toward her own psychology degree, determined to bridge the gap between her intuitive abilities and formal training. That's my personal philosophy, she said, pulling me closer on the couch we'd finally bought to replace her broken bed. Speaking of which, I have something for you. It's not my birthday, I protested, but she was already reaching for a small wrapped package on the coffee table. It's not a birthday present, she said. It's a congratulations on being featured in Psychology Today despite what the critics say present. I unwrapped it carefully, revealing a vintage first edition of Carl Jung's The Undiscovered Self. Georgia, I breathed, running my fingers over the worn cover. This must have cost a fortune. Read the inscription, she said softly. I opened to the front page, where someone had written in faded ink, "To my darling Margaret, may you always trust your intuition as much as your intellect. Love, Charles." Charles Jung gave this to his wife, Georgia explained. I thought you should have it. You've taught me that intuition and intellect don't have to be enemies. They can be partners. I looked up at her, this incredible woman who turned my carefully ordered world upside down and somehow made it better in the process. Georgia, I love you, she said simply. I know it's only been 8 months, and I know we're in the middle of building something complicated and uncertain, but I love you, all of you. The brilliant academic, the passionate advocate, the woman who breaks furniture in bed. I love your mind and your heart and the way you snort when you laugh really hard. I don't snort, I protested weakly, but I was crying now, overwhelmed by the intensity of what I felt for her. You absolutely snort, she said, wiping tears from my cheeks with her thumbs. And I love that too. I love you too, I managed. So much it scares me sometimes. Good scared or bad scared. Good scared, like ... Jumping dash off dash a dash cliff dash and dash hoping dash you dash can fly scared. Well, she said, pulling me into a kiss that tasted like promises. Lucky for you. I'm an expert at reading people's flight patterns. A year later, the critics still called our methods unorthodox. The university had officially revoked my guest lecture privileges, but none of it mattered when Georgia led me back to Whispering Pages on a crisp October afternoon, claiming she needed to pick up a book she'd ordered. What book? I asked as we walked through the familiar aisles. Oh, she said vaguely. Something about therapeutic relationships. She led me to the exact shelf where we'd met, and the psychology section that she'd once told me I was browsing all wrong. My heart started beating faster when I saw her pull down a book I didn't recognize. An old hardcover with a nondescript brown cover. Interesting, she murmured, opening it. This isn't what I expected at all. The book was hollowed out. Inside, nestled in a bed of red velvet, was a ring and a note written in Georgia's distinctive handwriting. The best minds are the ones that stay open. Marry me? I stared at it for a long moment, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. Well, Georgia asked, and when I looked up, she was down on one knee in the middle of the bookstore, completely oblivious to the small crowd of curious browsers who'd stopped to watch. Georgia, I whispered. I know it's crazy, she said, her voice shaking slightly with nerves. I know we've only been together for a year and we're still building our practice, and there are no guarantees about anything. But Emma, you make me want to be brave. You make me want to build something lasting. And I can't imagine reading anyone else's mind for the rest of my life. My laugh was wet with tears. Only if we buy this damn bookstore and turn it into our clinic. Deal, she said, standing up to slide the ring onto my finger. It fit perfectly, of course. She probably measured my finger while I was sleeping. The small crowd that had gathered burst into applause, and the elderly bookstore owner, Mr. Whitaker, appeared from behind the counter with tears in his eyes. Actually, he said, I've been thinking about retiring. If you two are serious about buying this place. Georgia and I looked at each other, and I saw the same wild excitement in her eyes that I felt bubbling up in my chest. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? She asked. That we're completely insane, but we're going to do it anyway? Exactly. 6 months later, we reopened Whispering Pages as Mindful Pages Therapeutic Center. We kept most of the books, they created a warm, welcoming atmosphere that our clients loved, but we added comfortable seating areas for sessions and a small office in the back. The bookstore's regular customers became some of our biggest advocates. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been coming in for her weekly romance novel fix for 20 years, started recommending us to her friends. The college students who used to study in the corners began opening up about their anxiety and depression. It's like therapy, but without the scary white walls, one of them told me during a session. Our wedding was small, just close friends, and family in the bookstore after hours, surrounded by thousands of stories and the promise of our own continuing narrative. Georgia wore a vintage dress she'd found at an estate sale, and I wore the suit I'd been saving for special occasions. We exchanged vows between the psychology and self-help sections, which felt appropriately symbolic. I promise to always tell you when you're overthinking, Georgia said, making me laugh through my tears. I promise to always trust your intuition. Even when it seems impossible, I replied. You may kiss the bride, said the efficient Dr. Sarah Kim, one of our first professional allies. And as our lips met, surrounded by books and friends and the scent of old paper and new possibilities, I thought about how love, like good therapy, is really about helping each other become the best versions of ourselves. Dr. Chun Blackwood, your 3 o'clock is here. Georgia calls from the front desk, where she's been reviewing intake forms and somehow managing to reorganize the entire self-help section at the same time. I finish my notes from the previous session and walk out to greet our newest client, a teenage girl whose parents are worried about her anxiety. She's sitting in one of our reading nooks, running her fingers along the spine of a book about mindfulness. Sarah? I ask gently. She looks up, and I see that particular combination of hope and skepticism that I've learned to recognize in new clients. Dr. Chun? Actually, it's Dr. Chun Blackwood now, I say with a smile. But you can call me Emma if you're more comfortable with that. And this is my wife and practice partner, Georgia. Georgia approaches with her usual warmth, and I watch. As Sarah's shoulders relax slightly, Georgia has this effect on people. She makes them feel seen without feeling judged. Sarah, Georgia says, settling into the chair across from her, before we start, I want you to know that this is your space. Whatever you share here stays here, and we go at where pace feels right for you. Okay, Sarah says quietly. Now, I say, pulling up my own chair, tell us what brought you here today. As Sarah begins to talk, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, I catch Georgia's eye. She gives me that same smile she had on the day we met, the one that says she knows exactly what I'm thinking. We've built something beautiful here, something that helps people heal and grow and find their own voices. The critics still call our methods unorthodox, and we still face challenges from traditionalists who don't understand our approach, but every day we get to witness small miracles. We get to see people discover their own strength, learn to trust their instincts, find the courage to be authentic in a world that often punishes authenticity. And at the end of each day, we go home to the apartment above the bookstore, yes. We live here now too, and Georgia reads my mind while I psychoanalyze her dreams. And we argue about whose turn it is to replace the bed frame, and we fall asleep, surrounded by books and the quiet satisfaction of work that matters. The best minds are the ones that stay open. Georgia had written in that hollowed-out book all those years ago. She was right, of course. She usually is. But the best hearts, I've learned, are the ones that stay brave enough to love, despite all the reasons not to. Despite the critics and the uncertainty and the furniture casualties. As for the bed frame, well, let's just say our new office has a very sturdy couch, and our home has reinforced everything else. Some stories end with happily ever after. Ours ends with happily ever after and slightly better soundproofing